Paris, a city of firelight and fury. 2,000 years of ambition carved into narrow medieval streets and grand Haussmann boulevards. Kings built it stone by stone. Revolutionaries tore it apart in the name of liberty. Artists, philosophers, lovers, and exiles remade it again and again, layer upon layer, century after century. And through every chapter of that long and bloody story, the people of Paris, stubborn, proud, impossible to silence, have pushed history forward. With every protest, every painting, every whispered idea that eventually changed the world. This is not a gentle story. Paris has been burned by Romans, besieged by Vikings, gutted by plague, butchered by its own revolutionaries, occupied by Nazis, and bombed by terrorists. And yet it keeps rebuilding, keeps reinventing itself, keeps insisting that it is still the center of the world. Every cobblestone in the Marais, every spire of Notre-Dame, every café terrace along the Seine carries some residue of that long, unbroken argument between destruction and renewal. Using historical records, archaeological evidence, and the testimony of the people who lived through each era, we are going to trace this city from a handful of damp huts on a river island to the global capital of art, fashion, revolution, and romance that exists today. From the marshy banks of the Seine to the glittering skyline of the 21st century, this is the entire history of Paris. Let's begin at the beginning, long before Paris was Paris at all.
Before Paris was Paris, it was nothing more than a cluster of huts on an island. Sometime around the 3rd century BC, a Celtic tribe known as the Parisi settled on what is now known as the Ile de la Cité, a small island sitting in the middle of the Seine River. They were fishermen, traders, and toll collectors who controlled a strategic river crossing on the route between the Mediterranean world and the lands of northern Gaul.
The exact meaning of the name Parisi is still debated by linguists, but many scholars connect it to old Celtic roots, meaning something close to the boat people or the working people, a name that captures exactly how they lived. The Parisi weren't building monuments or writing philosophy. They were surviving on a river, moving goods, watching the water, and quietly growing wealthy from the tin, wine, grain, and slaves that passed through their territory. Coins minted by the Parisi, gold staters discovered by archaeologists along the Seine Valley, some bearing stylized horses and abstract human faces, show a tribe that was far more sophisticated and commercially connected than the word village suggests. Excavations on the left bank have also uncovered traces of a substantial pre-Roman settlement, complete with timber housing and organized streets, suggesting that long before any Roman ever set foot here, the Parisii had already built something resembling an early town.
Then, in 52 BC, everything changed. Julius Caesar's legions arrived in Gaul, and the Romans did not ask permission to stay. As part of Caesar's wider campaign, the Gallic Wars, the Parisii joined a coalition of Gallic tribes resisting Roman conquest. According to Caesar's own account, the Parisii burned their own settlement and destroyed the bridges rather than let it fall intact into Roman hands, an early sign of the city's long habit of choosing destruction over submission. The Roman general Labienus crushed the rebellion in a decisive battle nearby, and the age of Gallic independence on the Seine came to an end.
Rome did what Rome always did after a conquest. It rebuilt, bigger and more efficient than before. The new settlement was called Lutetia, a name most historians connect to a Gaulish word for marsh or mid-water dwelling. Not exactly poetic, but an accurate description of a damp river settlement.
Roman Lutetia grew primarily on the left bank of the Seine, on the slopes of what is now called the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève. For roughly 3 centuries, it functioned as a fully developed provincial Roman town. Engineers built a forum, public baths fed by an aqueduct that stretched for kilometers, and an amphitheater, known today as the Arènes de Lutèce, capable of seating an estimated 15 to 17,000 spectators for gladiatorial games and
theatrical performances. Straight Roman roads, ordered grid streets, and functioning sanitation gave Lutetia a level of comfort that, for a Roman citizen, would have felt entirely unremarkable. Which was precisely the point. This unremarkable efficiency planted the seeds of what would later become Paris's left bank intellectual quarter. But empires do not last forever. By the 3rd century AD, the security of the Roman frontier was crumbling. Germanic tribes pressed in from beyond the Rhine, and waves of raiding parties reached deep into Gaul. Lutetia's exposed left bank settlement became too dangerous to defend, and its residents retreated to the natural fortress of the Ile de la Cité, throwing up defensive walls, in some cases built from the stones of dismantled Roman monuments. The Roman dream of an open, orderly provincial town was collapsing, and the settlement that emerged from the wreckage needed a new identity entirely. The 5th century was chaos across the entire Western world. The Roman Empire was disintegrating, and warbands from across the Rhine and the steppe were carving Europe into new kingdoms. In 451 AD, Attila the Hun led a vast army westward through Gaul, and by most accounts, the terrified population of Lutetia prepared to abandon the city rather than face him. According to tradition, a young Christian woman named Genevieve convinced the people to stay and pray rather than flee into the countryside. Whether through coincidence, strategy, or, as believers maintain, divine intervention, Attila's forces diverted toward Orleans instead of attacking the settlement on the Seine. Genevieve became Saint Genevieve, patroness and protector of the city, and her legend gave a frightened population something it desperately needed: hope, identity, and a reason to keep believing in their home. By 508 AD, Clovis I, king of the Franks, made the city his capital. This is the moment the settlement truly became Paris, reviving the name of the long-vanished Pariesi 1,000 years after they first settled the river island. Clovis's conversion to Christianity, baptized at Rheims according to tradition after a decisive battlefield victory, turned Paris into both the political and spiritual heart of a new Frankish kingdom. Churches rose where Roman temples once stood. The city was no longer simply a faded outpost of empire. It was becoming something distinctly its own. Peace did not last. Beginning around 845 AD, Norse raiders began sailing up the Seine in their longships, striking fast and retreating before any organized defense could respond. They had no interest in settling the city. They wanted silver, and Paris had it. On more than one occasion, the Frankish crown paid the Vikings enormous tributes, reportedly thousands of pounds of silver, simply to make them leave. It was less a military victory than an expensive form of extortion. The most severe test came in November 885 AD, when a Viking fleet of reportedly several hundred ships and tens of thousands of warriors blockaded the city for nearly a year. Only a few hundred Frankish defenders, under Count Odo and Bishop Goslin, held the fortified bridges connecting the Ile de la Cité to both riverbanks. They endured starvation, disease, and relentless assault until Emperor Charles the Fat finally arrived with a relief force in 886. Paris survived, but barely, and the siege taught the city a hard, lasting lesson. If it wanted to keep existing, it needed far stronger walls and far more permanent fortifications. By the year 1000 AD, Paris was still a modest town centered on its island, but markets were spreading onto both riverbanks, and the city was slowly becoming a true crossroads, a meeting point of political power, religious authority, and commercial ambition. The monuments that would define Paris for the next 1,000 years were about to rise from its growing streets. The 12th and 13th centuries are when Paris becomes undeniably important on the European stage.
In 1163, construction began on the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris, an almost 2-century-long undertaking that would become one of the defining masterpieces of Gothic architecture. Its flying buttresses, soaring rib vaults, and luminous rose windows represented the cutting edge of medieval engineering, a building seemingly designed to defy gravity and pull the eye and the soul toward heaven. Notre Dame was a statement. Paris was announcing itself to the Christian world. At the same time, scholars from across Europe were flocking to the left bank to study theology, philosophy, canon law, and medicine. What began as loose associations of teachers and students coalesced by the early 13th century into the University of Paris.
One of the very first universities in Europe, and soon one of the most prestigious. Because students and professors conducted their studies and debates in Latin, the surrounding neighborhood earned the name it still carries today, the Latin Quarter. Decades later, in 1257, the theologian Robert de Sorbonne founded a college for poor students of theology that would eventually lend its name, the Sorbonne, to the entire university. This was where medieval Europe came to think, argue, and refine the boundaries of knowledge. King Philip II Augustus, who ruled from 1180 to 1223, transformed Paris from a sprawling medieval town into a genuine fortified capital. He paved the city's major streets, which had until then been notoriously muddy,
and constructed the original Louvre, not as the art museum the world knows today, but as a formidable fortress with thick stone walls, a deep moat, and a central keep used to store the royal treasury. The message was unmistakable. Paris would not be caught undefended again. The city's population swelled dramatically. By 1300, Paris held an estimated 200,000 residents, making it one of the largest and most prosperous cities anywhere in Europe. Markets thrived, craft guilds controlled the trades, and the city expanded far beyond the original island, spreading across both banks as new bridges multiplied to connect them. This was also the era when the Knights Templar built their fortified headquarters, the Paris Temple, on the city's right bank, a walled compound so secure that French kings occasionally stored the royal treasury there.
That arrangement ended violently in 1307, when King Philip IV, deeply in debt to the order and suspicious of its power, ordered the arrest of every Templar in France in a single coordinated dawn raid. Years of brutal interrogation and trial followed, ending in 1314, when the order's last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris itself, a chilling preview of the city's long, recurring relationship with public execution as political theater. But wealth and visibility attract envy and catastrophe in equal measure, and Paris was about to learn just how brutally that lesson could be taught. Long before boulevards and grand avenues, Paris organized itself around its river crossings and its markets. In the 12th century, King Louis VI granted royal protection to a sprawling open-air marketplace on the right bank that would grow over the following centuries into less halls, eventually nicknamed the Belly of Paris for the sheer volume of food, fish, meat, and produce that passed through its stalls every single day to feed a growing population. Bridges, meanwhile, were never simply crossings. They were neighborhoods unto themselves, lined on both sides with houses, shops, and workshops built directly onto the structure, their upper floors leaning out over the water. Fires and floods periodically destroyed these bridge-top buildings, and they were gradually banned and cleared away only in the decades following the Revolution. Even the rhythm of bells, from Notre-Dame and the dozens of parish churches scattered across the city, structured the medieval Parisian day, marking the hours for prayer, market opening, and curfew alike. This was a city built on commerce, faith, and the constant churn of the river that gave it life. The 14th century very nearly destroyed Paris. It began with famine. Catastrophic harvest failures across northern Europe in the 1310s left fields rotting and granaries empty.
and ordinary Parisians starved in the streets of one of the wealthiest cities on the continent. Then came war. In 1337, England and France plunged into what would later be called the 100 Years' War, a brutal, generational conflict over the right to rule France itself. Paris sat at the political and symbolic center of the struggle from its very first decades. But nothing in the city's long history compares to what arrived in 1348, the Black Death. This plague pandemic, among the deadliest in recorded human history, tore through Paris with horrifying speed. Historians estimate that somewhere between a third and half of the city's population died within a matter of months. Bodies piled up faster than gravediggers could bury them. Mass graves were dug at the edges of the city, and chroniclers of the time described entire households dying together, doors sealed shut, streets falling silent, except for the carts collecting the dead at night. Physicians, working with no understanding of germ theory, prescribed remedies that ranged from useless to actively dangerous, while religious processions and public penance did nothing to slow the contagion. Trade collapsed, entire neighborhoods emptied. To live through the plague years in Paris was to watch your entire world end around you.
And the plague would return in smaller, recurring waves for centuries afterward, a recurring shadow over Parisian life well into the 17th century.
Social order frayed under the strain. In 1358, a violent peasant uprising remembered as the Jacquerie saw rural laborers revolt against a nobility many blamed for the war's devastation, while different factions inside Paris itself fought bitterly for control of the city. Decades later, in 1382, the Maletins revolt saw Parisian craftsmen and workers rise up against crushing new taxes. The city had become angry, hungry, and dangerously unstable. Then, in 1420, during the darkest stretch of the 100 Years' War, Paris fell into the hands of the English crown and its Burgundian allies. For roughly 16 years, Parisians lived under foreign occupation, while the legitimate French court fled south to the Loire Valley. It would take an extraordinary intervention to begin reversing the city's fortunes.
That intervention arrived in the unlikely form of a teenage peasant girl from the village of Domremy in Lorraine. By the late 1420s, the French cause looked all but lost. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled Paris and most of northern France. The legitimate heir to the throne was uncrowned and in exile, and French morale had collapsed after decades of war, famine, and plague. Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, appeared at the French royal court in 1429, just 17 years old, illiterate, and utterly convinced that she had been sent by God to save France. Somehow, she persuaded the uncrowned heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Charles, to grant her command of an army. Joan led French forces to lift the devastating siege of Orleans in May 1429, a turning point that electrified French troops and unsettled English commanders, who whispered that she was a sorcerer.
She did not, however, succeed in liberating Paris directly. An assault on the city in September 1429 failed, and Joan herself was wounded outside its walls. Even so, the momentum she generated shifted the entire war. The Dauphin was crowned King Charles VII at Reims Cathedral that same year, and France found a renewed sense of purpose. Joan's story ended in tragedy. Captured by Burgundian forces in 1430, she was sold to the English and tried for heresy in Rouen. In 1431, at just 19 years old, she was burned at the stake. But her impact long outlived her. Paris itself was finally liberated from English control in 1436, though the 100 Years' War would not formally end until 1453. By then, the city had been scarred by more than a century of plague, famine,
Civil unrest, and occupation. Recovery, when it finally came, would be slow. The 16th century brought both extraordinary beauty and horrifying bloodshed to Paris. King Francis I, who reigned from 1515 to 1547, imported the artistic ideals of the Italian Renaissance into France. He began transforming the medieval Louvre fortress into an elegant Renaissance palace, and he famously invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, where the aging master would spend the final years of his life. Art, architecture, and humanist learning flourished as Paris began to take on a new air of sophistication. But beneath the cultural flowering, a dangerous religious divide was widening. By the 1560s, intense tension between Protestants and Catholics was the knack.
France was split between its Catholic majority and a growing Protestant Huguenot minority, and Paris remained fiercely, often violently Catholic. That tension exploded on the night of August 23rd, 24th, 1572, in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The killing is widely believed to have been ordered, or at minimum sanctioned, by Queen Mother Catherine de' Medici, who feared growing Huguenot influence over her son, King Charles IX. What began as the targeted assassination of Huguenot leaders in Paris spiraled almost immediately into citywide slaughter. Catholic mobs hunted down Protestant men, women, and children in the streets, and bodies were reportedly thrown into the Seine by the hundreds. The violence spread far beyond the capital, and historians estimate that tens of thousands of Huguenots were killed across France in the weeks that followed, one of the darkest chapters in the city's long history of religious violence. The wars of religion dragged on for decades. In 1589, King Henry III was assassinated, and the Protestant Henry of Navarre, next in line for the throne,
found Paris closed to him as a heretic king. He eventually converted to Catholicism to secure his crown, reportedly remarking that Paris is well worth a mass. As Henry IV, he entered the city in 1594, ending its long siege and beginning the slow, deliberate work of healing a traumatized capital. He commissioned the Pont Neuf, still the oldest standing bridge across the Seine, completed in 1607, and laid out the Place des Vosges, one of the first deliberately planned residential squares in the city's history. Paris was recovering, but the religious scars left by decades of sectarian killing would run deep for generations.
The 17th century is when Paris became the undisputed capital of European grandeur. Under King Louis XIII and his formidable chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, royal power centralized dramatically in the capital. In 1635, Richelieu founded the Académie Française to regulate and protect the French language, a project that was as much about political and cultural control as it was about grammar. The real transformation, however, arrived with Louis XIV, the Sun King, who ruled from 1643 to 1715. Louis's own childhood in Paris had been shaped by terror. During the Fronde, a series of civil rebellions by the nobility and the Parisian populace between 1648 and 1653, the young king and his mother were forced to flee the capital in the middle of the night as armed crowds threatened the royal family's safety. Louis never forgot the humiliation, and historians widely agree that the memory of the Fronde shaped his lifelong distrust of Paris as a city of unpredictable mobs.
As an adult ruler, Louis treated monarchy itself as an art form. He expanded the Louvre, commissioned the Hôtel des Invalides as a home for wounded war veterans in 1670, and ordered the construction of grand new boulevards designed to showcase absolute royal power. Yet in 1682, Louis made a controversial decision that would shape the city for centuries. He moved his royal court away from Paris entirely, relocating to the newly built Palace of Versailles outside the city. Louis distrusted Paris, a city with a long memory of riot and rebellion, and wanted physical distance from its volatile population. Versailles became the political nerve center of France, while Paris remained its undisputed economic and cultural heart. Even without the king physically present, the city thrived. Intellectual salons drew together writers, philosophers, and artists. French cuisine was refined into an art form, and Parisian fashion, manners, and etiquette were copied across royal courts throughout Europe. By the close of the century, Paris and sophistication had become virtually synonymous, even as the relationship between the monarchy and the city's restless population continued to deteriorate beneath the surface. The 18th century began in elegance and ended in blood. This was the Age of Enlightenment, and Paris was its undisputed capital. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Denis Diderot gathered in cafés and salons across the city, questioning royal authority, debating the nature of reason and liberty, and imagining radically new forms of government. Diderot's monumental encyclopedia, compiled and published in Paris, attempted to assemble the whole of human knowledge in one place and directly challenge the Church's traditional monopoly on truth. Ideas had become dangerous, and Paris was overflowing with them. The city's intellectual salons, often hosted by
But beneath the glittering salons, the city itself was rotting. Paris's population swelled past 600,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Europe, and the poor were crowded into filthy, disease-ridden neighborhoods, while the aristocracy lived in conspicuous, often oblivious luxury. By the 1780s, the city's ancient cemeteries were so overcrowded and shallow that decomposing remains were literally poisoning the air and contaminating groundwater in surrounding neighborhoods. The solution was as practical as it was macabre. Authorities began transferring millions of skeletal remains into the abandoned limestone quarry tunnels running beneath the city, working largely at night by torchlight to avoid public alarm. These tunnels became the catacombs of Paris, a vast subterranean ossuary holding the bones of an estimated 6 million people, arranged with eerie, deliberate artistry into walls of skulls and femur.
Stacked floor to ceiling, small sections remain open to visitors today. A literal underground monument to centuries of Parisian death, stretching for many miles beneath streets that ordinary Parisians walk across every day without a second thought. By the 1780s, the French monarchy itself was effectively bankrupt, drained by costly wars and the lavish spending of Louis XV and Louis XVI. Crushing taxes fell disproportionately on the poor, while the nobility paid almost nothing, and the price of bread soared out of reach for ordinary families. Paris had reached its breaking point, and on July 14th, 1789, the people of the city acted.
Parisians stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress prison that had become the single most potent symbol of royal tyranny. In purely military terms, the assault made little sense. Only 7 prisoners were inside the building. But symbolically, it mattered enormously. The French Revolution had begun, and Paris would be its central stage for the next decade of upheaval. What followed was chaos on a scale the city had rarely seen.
The royal family was forcibly brought from Versailles to Paris and confined within the Tuileries Palace. In 1792, the monarchy was formally abolished. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in what is now the Place de la Concorde, watched by enormous crowds. 9 months later, Queen Marie
Antoinette made the same fate. The revolution famously began devouring its own children. The Reign of Terror, led by Maximilien Robespierre, sent tens of thousands of nobles, priests, and even fellow revolutionaries deemed insufficiently radical to the guillotine. The streets of Paris ran with blood, quite literally, as executions became a near daily public spectacle. By 1794, Robespierre himself was guillotined, and the worst of the terror finally ended. France emerged exhausted, traumatized, and desperately searching for stability. That stability arrived in the form of a young Corsican artillery general named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon seized power in a coup in 1799, and Paris soon became the capital of a sprawling European empire that, at its height, stretched from Spain to the borders of Russia. He was, by any definition, a dictator,
But he was also an obsessive builder who understood that lasting power required permanent monuments. In 1806, he commissioned the Arc de Triomphe to honor the victories of his armies, though it would not be completed until 1836, long after his death. He ordered the construction of the Rue de Rivoli, a grand, uniform thoroughfare cutting through the historic heart of the city, and he reformed the entire French legal system through the Napoleonic Code, a body of law that continues to influence civil legal systems across Europe and beyond to this day. Napoleon was also, quite openly, a plunderer.
As his armies swept across the continent, they looted artwork, antiquities, and treasures from conquered territories and brought them back to Paris, where Napoleon transformed the Louvre into a grand public museum to display them. The Louvre became a statement in itself. Paris was the cultural capital of the world, and all roads and all stolen masterpieces led there. In 1804, the same year Napoleon crowned himself emperor, the city opened the Père Lachaise Cemetery on its eastern edge, a sprawling, park-like burial ground that would eventually become the resting place of figures from Frédéric Chopin to Oscar Wilde, and a permanent reminder that Paris has always built its identity as much from its dead as from its living. But empires built on conquest rarely last. Napoleon's catastrophic invasion of Russia in 1812 and his decisive defeat at Leipzig in 1813 brought enemy armies to the gates of Paris itself. In 1814, the city was occupied by Russian, Prussian, and Austrian troops, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate, exiled to the island of Elba. He returned briefly in 1815 for the period known as the 100 Days, but his final defeat at Waterloo ended the dream for good. Napoleon was exiled a second time, now to the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. Paris was left to reckon with the staggering
A legacy of an empire that had reshaped the map of Europe, and a capital that was now occupied, humbled, and uncertain of what would come next. After Napoleon's fall, the restored Bourbon monarchy returned to the throne, but Parisians had not forgotten the lessons of 1789. In July 1830, the city rose up once again, overthrowing King Charles X in what became known as the July Revolution. Barricades went up across the streets, a tactic of urban resistance that would define Parisian uprisings for generations to come. A new citizen king, Louis Philippe, took the throne, but his cautious, bourgeois-friendly rule satisfied almost no one. In February 1848, revolution erupted yet again. Louis Philippe fled into exile, and the Second Republic was declared amid widespread celebration. But within months, Parisian workers rose up once more in the bloody June Days uprising,
demanding deeper social and economic reform. The army crushed the rebellion with brutal force, killing thousands in the streets. Paris had become, in the starkest sense, a city at war with itself. Out of this turbulence rose Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the former emperor, who was elected president of the Republic in 1848. In 1851, he staged his own coup and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III.
Despite his authoritarian methods, Napoleon III oversaw a transformation of Paris that still defines the city's appearance today. He appointed Baron George Eugene Haussmann to redesign the entire urban fabric of the capital. Haussmann's renovations, carried out roughly between 1853 and 1870, were nothing short of radical. He demolished entire medieval neighborhoods, their narrow, winding, easily barricaded streets, many of them dark, fetid, and barely touched by sunlight, and replaced them with wide, uniform boulevards lined with elegant apartment buildings featuring the now iconic cream-colored limestone facades, wrought iron balconies, and matching slate mansard roofs. He built new public parks modeled partly on London's, modernized the city's sewer system into a vast underground network that visitors can still tour today, and installed thousands of gas streetlights that turned Paris into one of the first cities in the world to earn the nickname the City of Light for its illuminated nights alone. The Franco-Prussian War proved disastrous for France. The French army was crushed, Napoleon III himself was captured at the Battle of Seine, and by September 1870, Prussian forces had surrounded and besieged Paris. The city held out for 4 desperate months, its residents reduced to eating rats, household pets, and even animals from the city's zoos to survive the winter. In January 1871, Paris finally surrendered, but the city's humiliation was far from over.
In March 1871, in the bitter aftermath of defeat and siege, Parisians refused to accept the terms of surrender quietly. Radical workers, socialists, and ordinary citizens established the Paris Commune, a short-lived revolutionary government that would last barely 2 months. The communards pushed for sweeping social reforms, workers' rights, and direct democratic governance. Idealistic, often disorganized, and ultimately doomed in the face of a hostile national government based at Versailles. That government sent in troops to crush the uprising, and what followed, in May 1871, became known as the Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, one of the most brutal episodes of urban warfare in European history. Government forces killed an estimated 10 to 20,000 communards, many executed en masse after surrendering. In their final desperate days, communards set fire to public buildings, including parts of the Tuileries Palace and the Hôtel de Ville. Paris had been traumatized yet again by foreign siege and by civil massacre within the space of a single year. But from these ashes, almost improbably, came one of the most luminous chapters in the city's entire history.
And entertainment. Impressionist painters, Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, revolutionized the visual arts, capturing fleeting light and ordinary modern life on canvas in ways that scandalized traditional critics and thrilled a new public. The Moulin Rouge opened its doors in 1889, and Parisian cabaret culture became internationally legendary. Writers such as Émile Zola and Victor Hugo defined the literary conscience of the age, confronting poverty, injustice, and the human cost of rapid modernization. In 1889, for the World's Fair marking the centennial of the Revolution, engineer Gustave Eiffel completed his namesake Iron Tower in just over 2 years,
using roughly 18,000 individual iron pieces and 2.5 million rivets, assembled by a workforce of around 300 laborers without a single fatality recorded during construction, a remarkable safety record for the era. Parisians initially despised it, dismissing it as a metal eyesore that disfigured the city's skyline. A group of prominent artists and writers even published a public letter condemning the useless and monstrous tower before it was finished. Within a generation, however, the Eiffel Tower became the unmistakable symbol of Paris itself, of modernity, engineering ambition, and human reach toward the sky. In 1900, the Paris Metro opened its first lines, its distinctive Art Nouveau station entrances, designed by architect Hector Guimard, becoming icons in their own right. The Grand Palais and Petit Palais rose along the Seine, built for the 1900 Exposition Universelle. Paris was thriving, cosmopolitan, and electric with possibility. But beneath the glamour of the Belle Époque, the great powers of Europe were quietly arming themselves, forging rigid alliances and inching toward catastrophe. In the summer of 1914, the lights of that golden era began going out across the entire continent. Paris was not only the Belle Époque stage for painting and cabaret, it was also the birthplace of an entirely new art form. In December 1895, brothers Auguste and Louis Lumière held the first public screening of projected motion pictures in the basement of the Grand Café on the Boulevard des Capucines, charging admission to an audience that watched, astonished,
as a black and white train appeared to rush directly toward them on screen. Within a few short years, filmmaker George Méliès was producing elaborately staged fantasy films from his studio outside the city, including the now iconic A Trip to the Moon in 1902, widely regarded as one of the first true science fiction films ever made. Paris had given the world cinema itself, one more invention, alongside the Eiffel Tower and the metro, that would carry the city's name and imagination across the entire globe.
World War I very nearly broke Paris. Although the main front lines settled north and east of the capital, the city lived for 4 years under constant, immediate threat. In September 1914, German forces advanced to within roughly 30 miles of Paris during the First Battle of the Marne. Parisians could reportedly hear distant artillery fire from within the city itself. In one of the war's most famous logistical improvisations, the French military commandeered the city's fleet of taxicabs, remembered ever since as the taxis of the Marne, to rush thousands of reserve troops to the crumbling front line. The desperate maneuver worked, and Paris was saved, though only barely. For 4 grinding years, the city endured occasional air raids, strict rationing, and an endless stream of wounded soldiers arriving from the trenches at the city's railway stations, many of which were converted into makeshift military hospitals.
Women took over jobs in factories, transit, and offices left vacant by men sent to the front, quietly reshaping the city's social fabric in ways that would echo for decades. Long-range German artillery, including the so-called Paris gun, shelled the city from over 70 miles away in the war's final year, a chilling preview of the kind of warfare the 20th century would perfect. The war finally ended in November 1918, and the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 just outside the capital, in the very palace built by Louis XIV, formally closed the conflict. France emerged victorious, but at a horrific cost. Well over 1 million French soldiers had died, and an entire generation had been scarred beyond recognition.
The 1920s brought the année folle, the crazy years, and Paris reclaimed its position as the cultural capital of the world almost overnight. American jazz flooded into the city's nightclubs, carried in part by Black American performers such as Josephine Baker, who became a sensation on Parisian stages and found in the city a freedom and acclaim that had been denied to her at home. Writers and artists, including Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, and Pablo Picasso, made Paris their adopted home, forming the core of what became known as the Lost Generation, expatriates seeking artistic freedom and reinvention in a city that offered both. Surrealism emerged from the same restless cafés as
Women took over jobs in factories, transit, and offices left vacant by men sent to the front, quietly reshaping the city's social fabric in ways that would echo for decades. Long-range German artillery, including the so-called Paris gun, shelled the city from over 70 miles away in the war's final year, a chilling preview of the kind of warfare the 20th century would perfect. The war finally ended in November 1918, and the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 just outside the capital, in the very palace built by Louis XIV, formally closed the conflict. France emerged victorious, but at a horrific cost. Well over 1 million French soldiers had died, and an entire generation had been scarred beyond recognition.
Electric and unmistakably modern, the place to be for anyone young, ambitious, or simply running from something back home. The celebration could not last forever. By the 1930s, global economic depression had tightened its grip across Europe, and fascism was rising rapidly in Germany, Italy, and Spain. Political tensions inside Paris intensified sharply, culminating in violent far-right riots in 1934. Refugees fleeing persecution elsewhere on the continent began arriving in growing numbers. By 1939, war had returned to Europe, and this time, Paris would not be spared its full horror.
World War II brought genuine darkness to Paris.
When Nazi Germany invaded France in May 1940, the French military collapsed within a matter of weeks. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. City authorities had declared it an open city, surrendering without resistance to spare it from destruction. The French government fled south, eventually establishing the collaborationist Vichy regime, and the swastika was raised over the Eiffel Tower. For the next 4 years, Paris lived under Nazi occupation. Cafés, theaters, and nightclubs remained open, but now served German officers as their primary clientele, while ordinary Parisians queued for hours on rationed bread, meat, and coal, and a strict nighttime curfew emptied the boulevards after dark. World War II brought genuine darkness to Paris. When Nazi Germany invaded France in May 1940, the French military collapsed within a matter of weeks. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. City authorities had declared it an open city, surrendering without resistance to spare it from destruction. The French government fled south, eventually establishing the collaborationist Vichy regime, and the swastika was raised over the Eiffel Tower. For the next 4 years, Paris lived under Nazi occupation. Cafés, theaters, and nightclubs remained open, but now served German officers as their primary clientele, while ordinary Parisians queued for hours on rationed bread, meat, and coal, and a strict nighttime curfew emptied the boulevards after dark.
The persecution of Jewish Parisians escalated with horrifying speed. In the infamous Vel-Div roundup of July 1942, more than 13,000 Jews were arrested by French police acting on Nazi orders and deported to concentration camps. The overwhelming majority never returned. Yet resistance persisted throughout the occupation. The French resistance carried out sabotage operations, published underground newspapers, gathered intelligence for the Allies, and helped smuggle Allied airmen out of occupied territory through clandestine escape networks that stretched across the country. Ordinary Parisians resisted in countless small, dangerous ways, distributing clandestine leaflets, hiding Jewish neighbors in attics and cellars, forging identity papers, risking their lives for acts that today might seem modest, but carried extraordinary risk, including deportation or execution under Nazi occupation.
In August 1944, with Allied forces closing in on the city, Parisians rose up. The Paris uprising began on August 19, and barricades returned to the streets once more, just as they had in 1830, 1848, and 1871. The resistance fought German occupiers street by street. Adolf Hitler reportedly ordered the city burned rather than surrendered intact, but the German military commander in Paris, Dietrich von Choltitz, refused to carry out the order. On August 25, 1944, French and American forces entered the liberated city, and General Charles de Gaulle walked triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées before enormous, jubilant crowds. Paris was free, but liberation arrived alongside
a darker reckoning. Collaborators faced public punishment, sometimes brutally so, and the city was left to grapple with painful questions of complicity, survival, and identity after 4 years of occupation and betrayal.
Recovery after the war took years, and it was as much spiritual as physical. Paris became a global center of existentialist philosophy, with thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir holding court in left-bank cafés, grappling publicly with questions of freedom, responsibility, and meaning in the shadow of the war's horrors. Economically, France rebuilt with significant help from the American Marshall Plan, and by the 1950s and 1960s, Paris was modernizing rapidly. New high-rise suburban housing developments, the banlieues, were constructed to absorb a growing population, while the Boulevard Périphérique Ring Road, completed in stages through the 1960s and early 1970s, encircled the historic city and signaled its sprawling growth beyond the old core. In 1947, designer Christian Dior launched.
But old tensions resurfaced in new forms. In May 1968, Paris erupted again. Not in war, but in mass protest.
Students at the Sorbonne occupied their own campus, demanding sweeping educational reform and challenging entrenched authority across French society, drawing inspiration from civil rights movements and anti-war protests happening simultaneously across the United States and elsewhere in Europe. Workers across the country joined in, launching some of the largest general strikes in modern French history, with an estimated 9 million workers walking off the job at the movement's peak. Barricades rose once more in the Latin Quarter, paving stones were torn up and hurled at riot police, and the slogans painted across Parisian walls that spring, many of them sharp, surreal, and unmistakably Parisian in their wit, are still quoted and reprinted today. The May 68 protests never toppled the French government, but they permanently altered French culture and politics, sparking lasting debates over gender, sexuality, education, and workers' rights that continue to shape the country today. The 1970s brought further architectural upheaval. In 1977, President Georges Pompidou's namesake cultural center opened, his celebrated New Look collection from his atelier on Avenue Montaigne, redefining post-war femininity with cinched waists and voluminous skirts, and reaffirming Paris's claim to be the fashion capital of the world.
A radical, inside-out structure, with its structural and mechanical systems exposed on the exterior, shocking architectural traditionalists and signaling that Paris was prepared to embrace bold, modern design, however controversial. The last 4 decades have seen Paris continue to evolve, often dramatically. In 1981, President François Mitterrand launched his ambitious Grands Projets, a series of massive architectural initiatives designed to leave a permanent mark on the capital. The glass Louvre Pyramid, designed by architect I.M. Pei and completed in 1989, was fiercely controversial at the time of its unveiling, but has since become one of the most iconic structures in the city. The Opera Bastille opened the same year, and the Grande Arche de la Défense, a vast modern echo of the historic Arc de Triomphe, was likewise completed in 1989, deliberately aligned along the same historic axis. Paris was asserting its continued relevance on the world stage.
Yet modernity brought new and persistent challenges. The banlieues, once envisioned as symbols of post-war progress, increasingly became associated with poverty, unemployment, and social tension as waves of immigration from former French colonies in North and West Africa reshaped the demographic makeup of the metropolitan region, while often facing discrimination and economic exclusion. Serious riots erupted in 2005, sparked by the deaths of 2 teenagers fleeing police, and the deep divide between central Paris, wealthy, historic, postcard perfect, and its surrounding suburbs has remained difficult to ignore ever since, a recurring fault line in French political life. Terrorism struck the city with devastating force in the 21st century. In January 2015,
Gunmen attacked the offices of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, killing 12 people. Later that same year, in November 2015, coordinated terrorist attacks across multiple sites in the city killed 130 people. Paris mourned deeply, but it refused to be broken by either atrocity.
in April 2019, Notre-Dame Cathedral caught fire, and the world watched in real time as the cathedral's iconic spire collapsed into flames. The loss felt to many like watching a piece of the city's own soul burn. Yet true to its history, Paris committed almost immediately to rebuilding, and the restored cathedral reopened to the public in December 2024, its spire and stonework painstakingly reconstructed using traditional medieval techniques. That same year, Paris hosted the Summer Olympic Games, showcasing the city, its monuments, its river, its enduring sense of theater on a global stage once again. Today, Paris stands as a city of contrasts, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a global tourism magnet, a seat of political power, and a city still openly wrestling with questions of inequality,
Identity, and what comes next. Its population today, across the wider metropolitan region, numbers well over 10 million people from every corner of the globe, a far cry from the few thousand fishermen who once huddled on the Ile de la Cité, yet recognizably the descendants of that same restless, river-bound, fiercely independent spirit. But if Paris's 2,000-year history teaches anything, it is that the city endures. It has been conquered by Romans,
Besieged by Vikings, devastated by plague, beheaded its own king, occupied by foreign armies twice over, and torn apart repeatedly by its own people. And every single time, it has rebuilt, often more beautiful and more confident than it was before. Paris is not, and has never been, a perfect city. Its long history is scarred by violence, oppression, and genuine darkness. Religious massacre, revolutionary terror, colonial exploitation, and the horrors of Nazi occupation all leave permanent marks on any honest accounting of its past. But this is also the city that gave the world some of its most enduring ideas about liberty, reason, and human dignity. The conviction that ordinary people have the right to shape their own future, by force if necessary. From the storming of the Bastille to the barricades of 1968, from St. Genevieve's defiance of Attila to the firefighters who saved Notre-Dame's stone towers in 2019, the through line of Parisian history is a refusal to simply disappear. For better and for worse, Paris has never stopped fighting for that idea.
And 2,000 years later, it still hasn't.
So there it is, 2,000 years of Paris, from a small Celtic fishing settlement on a river island to the City of Light. We have watched it rise from the ashes of the Roman Empire, survive Viking sieges and medieval plague, behead a king, build an empire, burn its own palaces, and rebuild its own cathedral from fire. If you enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the history of the world's most fascinating cities. There is always more to explore. And as always, we'll see you in the past.